Have you ever stopped to think that maybe, just maybe, we're reading ancient texts all wrong? I mean, what if a book we thought was just full of hymns and spiritual verses was actually a highly technical field guide? A manual of ancient science hidden right there in plain sight? Well, today, we're going to decode a text that might be exactly that, and it could challenge everything you thought you knew about the history of science.
Just look at this quote. This really sets the stage. It sounds like something straight out of a modern scientific paper, doesn't it? But our research points to it coming from the Taittiriya Aranyaka, an ancient Sanskrit text. I mean, that one sentence alone establishes this incredible tone of scientific rigor. And that really brings us to the big question for this whole explainer. What happens when we look at this text not as pure metaphysics, but as a systematic, observational guide to the real, physical world? We're going to follow the research and see exactly where it takes us. So, here's our game plan. We'll start by looking at the text's opening, not as a prayer, but more like a pre-flight checklist. Then, we'll dig into its core scientific method. After that, we'll see how they use that method to actually read the seasons, understand the entire biosphere as one big energy system, and finally, why all of this was literally a matter of life and death.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning. Traditionally, the first few verses of the Aranyaka are read as these beautiful prayers for peace and divine blessing. But what if they were serving a much more practical purpose? This new reading flips that whole idea on its head.
So instead of a prayer, this analysis sees the intro as a straight-up practical protocol. Think of a scientist in a lab today, running through a checklist before starting a super important experiment. It's all about making sure that the observers and whatever instruments they're using are totally ready for accurate data collection. And the level of detail here is just remarkable. The text doesn't just say, "let things be clear." No, the research shows it names the exact types of interference you need to clear out. Things like atmospheric noise, heat shimmer, instrument drift, obstructions like darkness, and even atmospheric pollution. It reads just like a modern, highly systematic error clearance protocol. It's amazing. Okay, so if the text kicks off with an error check, what was the actual method of investigation? Well, that brings us to the core scientific framework that pretty much props up everything else in the text.
The system is called pramana, which this analysis translates as a four-part validation protocol. This seems to be the text's own built-in scientific method, and it was designed specifically for making valid, repeatable measurements of the sun.
And this is where you can really see how sophisticated the system was. For a measurement to be considered valid, it had to get a green light from all four of these pillars. You needed your historical data, your own direct observation right now, testimony from a whole network of other observers, and your calculated inferences. And here's the kicker. If they didn't all line up, that disagreement itself became the new finding to investigate.
Now, all of this observation was anchored to a master timekeeping unit called the samvatsara. This is described as an irreversible, accumulating annual cycle. It's like the master clock that never turns back, providing the fundamental framework for every single other measurement of time.
All right, so we've got an error check and a really robust scientific method. But how did they actually use it? Let's get practical and look at some concrete examples of how this system was applied to identify the seasons.
The text gives these incredibly specific, observable criteria to confirm when each season had arrived. See, this isn't about checking a date on a calendar. It's about what you can physically see, feel, and measure in the world around you. Let's start with summer, or Grishma.
So, to confirm it was officially summer, 3 different things had to be happening all at once. A white-robed sky, which means a very specific kind of white haze, the presence of Rudra groups, which is decoded as the hot, dry Lu winds blowing in from the Thar Desert, and an earth-striking heat. You needed all 3, no guesswork involved. And this is so important. This isn't just poetry. The analysis identifies it as a practical, life-or-death survival protocol for dealing with those dangerous Lu winds. Knowing these signs wasn't just some intellectual exercise, it was absolutely essential for staying alive.
Now, let's switch gears and contrast that harshness of summer with the markers for autumn or shard. You'll see the whole observational language changes, reflecting a completely different reality in the environment.
For autumn, the criteria are a gold-gleaming clear sky and fresh, unworn air. That incredibly pristine, clear atmosphere you only get after the monsoon rains have washed everything clean. The source even points out that the tone of the text itself seems to relax here, almost as if the observers themselves are breathing a sigh of relief. Okay, so from these very specific seasonal protocols, the text then zooms way out to describe this grand, interconnected system. It actually presents a complete model of the entire biosphere as a single closed-loop energy cycle.
It's called the Panchagni, or the five-fire cycle. And this analysis interprets it not as some spiritual metaphor, but as a physical description of energy transformation, a working model of how solar energy drives the entire planetary life support system.
And here's the flow. It all starts with the sun's energy. That solar energy then drives the rain system. The rain allows the earth to produce food. Humans eat that food and metabolize it for energy. And then, upon death, the body's components are returned to the system, which completes the loop. It is a stunningly modern-sounding description of how the biosphere works.
And this brings us to the final and maybe the most critical piece of this whole puzzle. Why go to all this trouble, right? Why create such an elaborate system of observation and validation and timekeeping? Well, according to the research, the answer is found in one devastatingly clear verse.
Whatever progeny fall away from the Samvatsara fall away. It's a very stark warning. And remember, the Samvatsara is that master annual clock, that perfectly calibrated calendar.
And the meaning here is, honestly, it's profound. A community that loses its grip on the calendar, one that can no longer accurately track the seasons and predict the all-important arrival of the monsoon, is a community that is going to collapse. The entire scientific system we've been talking about, from the error checks to the seasonal markers, was ultimately a civilizational survival tool. The calendar was life.
And that just leaves us with this final, massive question. I mean, if this one text can be reread as a sophisticated scientific manual, how many other ancient texts from all around the world might be holding similar systematically encoded knowledge, just waiting for us to find the right key to unlock them?
Okay, so let's jump right in. When you hear a name like the Taittiriya Aranyaka, what kind of pops into your head? You're probably thinking ancient rituals, maybe some mystical chants, definitely complex philosophy, right? It just sounds like a sacred text from a world that's long gone. But what if that whole idea is just completely off? What if this text isn't about religion at all? What if it's actually a highly technical, honest-to-goodness scientific manual, a guide designed for one reason, to ensure a civilization's survival against all odds? Well, our research into its first section, a part called Prashna 1, shows something incredible. This text is way better understood not as a holy book, but as an ancient field manual. And I mean that literally. It's an operational document. Think of it as a guide for a dedicated team of observers whose entire job was to systematically track the sky, the weather, and the water cycle. Every single line in it describes either what to observe, how to make sure your data is good, or how to pass that knowledge on without a single error creeping in. Now, here's what's really cool. The name itself. Aranyaka basically means forest text. And for centuries, people took that symbolically, a spiritual text for quiet meditation away from it all. But it turns out there was a super practical reason for the name. It was a technical requirement. If you wanted to get clean data on the stars, on the atmosphere, you had to be in the forest. You had to get away from the light pollution of campfires, away from the smoke that would mess up your view of the horizon, and away from all the noise. The forest wasn't a metaphor. It was a non-negotiable part of the scientific setup. So if we're talking about a functional field manual, that begs a huge question. Who were the people actually using this thing? And what kind of world were they living in that they needed such a crazy detailed guide? Let's get into who these observers were, because wow, they were living right on the edge. First thing you have to know, these people were not priests, not in the way we think of them. They were highly trained specialists. You could call them professional scientists, and they had one absolutely critical job: maintain an accurate calendar. Why? Because the survival of their entire agricultural community depended on it. And the text itself tells you just how high the stakes were. This quote right here, it's not some deep philosophical metaphor. It is a literal, stark warning. It's saying any community that loses its calendar calibration, that falls away from the annual cycle, the Samvatsara, they will collapse, they will die. Those that stay locked into it, they survive. It's that simple and it's that brutal. So their whole scientific program was basically built to fight three huge existential fears. Fear number one, monsoon failure. You get the calendar wrong, even by a little bit, you miss your planting window, and that means famine. Simple as that. Number 2, a knowledge rupture. If an expert observer died before they could perfectly transfer their data and their skills, the whole system could just fall apart. And number 3, the Lu wind. This was a specific, deadly drying wind that could sweep through in the summer and just wipe out crops, livestock, everything. Their manual was designed to predict and survive all of this. So how in the world did they fight back against these threats? Well, it wasn't with prayers or rituals. It was with something that looks shockingly like a complete and incredibly robust scientific method. At the very heart of their science was the Samvatsara, that annual cycle. But to them, it wasn't just a year. It was their master clock. It was the instrument that integrated all their data from the sky and the ground. It was self-calibrating. They used the equinoxes for that. And they saw it as this irreversible force that was the ultimate judge of whether they would live or die. And they didn't just track it as one big chunk. They broke it down into a 6-season operational plan. And each season had a very specific, very practical goal. Vasanta, the spring, that's when you calibrated the whole system. Grishma, summer, was basically a survival countdown, watching for that killer Lu wind. Varsha was all about assessing the monsoon. Sharad, timing the harvest perfectly. And then the 2 winter seasons, Hemanta and Shishira, were for calculating their food stores and then carefully monitoring how fast they were using them up. It's a full-blown project plan for surviving another year. Now, at the core of all this work was something the text calls the four-pramana method. Pramana is just a word that means a source of valid knowledge or a way to verify something. And they had 4 of them. First up, smrti, that's the historical record, all their long-term data. Second, prachaksha, that's direct, with your own eyes, observation in real time. Third, you've got ATM, which is transmitted testimony, so data coming in from other teams in your network. And finally, anumana, calculated inference, figuring things out based on all the other data you have. And here is the kicker. This is the big aha moment. The text says it, plain as day. A measurement is only considered valid when all 4 of those methods agree. Your historical logs, what you're seeing right now, reports from your colleagues, and your own calculations. They all have to line up. I mean, that is a complete, cross-verifying scientific method written down thousands of years ago. And let's be super clear here. The text applies this method to do very specific things, like measuring the size of the solar disk. This isn't some abstract, philosophical statement about different ways of knowing things. It is a strict, practical, step-by-step protocol for doing actual science. Which brings us to the last and maybe the most amazing part of this whole story. I mean, if this knowledge was so complex, so important, how on earth did it manage to survive for millennia, long after anyone even remembered what it was for? You can see just how systematic their thinking was in concepts like the Panchagani cycle. It literally means 5 fires, and it's this stunningly early model of how energy flows through the biosphere. Check it out. It starts with the first fire, the sun, which heats the atmosphere. That creates the second fire, clouds. They produce the third, rain. Rain grows the 4th fire, life. And the 5th and final fire is death, which returns everything to the system to start all over again. They really understood the whole cycle. They were absolutely terrified of breaking that chain of knowledge. This quote here, it reveals a deep, deep fear. To abandon your observing partner, the person who holds the other half of the knowledge, was basically to be cut off from society itself. To them, the knowledge chain was everything. So to protect it, they built this incredible, multi-layered system of error correction. Think about this. A 2-person minimum on every team, always. A rule that information had to be recited and confirmed 3 separate times to be considered valid. They used these complex, interlocking verbal algorithms that could actually detect if a single syllable was out of place. And a hard and fast rule that knowledge was only officially transferred after you'd done the work together side by side. The system was designed to be bulletproof. And here's the bottom line. The manual survived because the protocols worked. They worked so perfectly, in fact, that the text continued to be recited word for word as a kind of religious liturgy long, long after the original civilization and its science program were gone. What we have today is basically a perfectly preserved scientific manual, kept safe for thousands of years because its transmission system was just that good. Okay, so what if an ancient text wasn't just a collection of myths or rituals, but something else entirely? What if it was an incredibly precise environmental log? a kind of ancient weather report. Well, today we're putting that wild idea to the ultimate test. Let's dive right in. So, this is really the core question, isn't it? Can we take an ancient text, in this case one called Prashna 1, and actually test it with modern science? We're going to take its specific, observable claims and hold them up against the hard, physical record of the Earth itself. We're talking geology, climate data, the whole shebang. And to be crystal clear, we are not here to assume the text is true. We're here to test if it's true. All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. Think of it like a detective story. We've got 4 major environmental clues that we're going to pull from the text. Then we'll see if the physical, geological record agrees with them. And finally, we'll deliver the verdict that the Earth itself provides. So let's get into the source material. What makes Prashna 1 so special and so perfect for this kind of investigation is that it's not vague at all. It contains incredibly specific, and therefore totally testable, observations about the world its authors lived in. You can almost think of this text as an ancient instruction manual for observing the environment. It describes seasons, weather patterns, rivers, and because its claims are so specific, we can apply a really strict scientific method. We'll use the hard evidence from geology to test the text, not the other way around. The text makes a claim, science checks the facts. Simple as that. So our investigation begins with the first and probably the biggest clue mentioned in the text, a great flowing river, a river which it actually names. See, the text doesn't talk about the Saraswati River like it's a distant memory or some kind of myth. No, it's talked about as a present, functional, living river. It even seems to describe daily checks on its water flow, which points to a very real and very active water system. And this is where modern science really steps up to the plate. We have multiple, independent, peer-reviewed studies that all confirm the timeline. You've got research by Clift and his colleagues using Zircon dating showing its channels were active after 2500 BCE. Geosen and his team established it was a major river during the Harappan period. Sampani's work using a different dating method confirms it too. And what's really cool is that the text's mention of a daily flood risk, that's perfectly consistent with a powerful, unpredictable, glacier-fed river system. So just stop and think about what this means. For the text to describe the Saraswati as this mighty, living river, its observations simply had to have been made before the river started drying up. So right off the bat, geology gives us our first hard deadline. These observations must have happened before 1900 BCE. Okay, on to our next clue. This one is pretty dramatic. The text describes a specific season, the deep winter, in really stark and terrifying terms. It speaks of famine, of people storing water in their homes, and of a time when the rains just stopped. Now let's compare that description to a known global climate catastrophe, the 4.2 kilo-year event, which happened around 2200 BCE. Geologists know this was a period of severe, abrupt drought. It was a massive monsoon failure that affected this entire region. You see how it lines up? The text's famine in the sky systems seems to be a perfect description of a documented, multi-decade aridification event. And again, the physical evidence is just overwhelming, especially because it comes from so many different independent lines of inquiry. Gisha's team found evidence in cave formations, Stahlwasser found it in sediment cores at the bottom of the ocean, Prasad found it in ancient lake beds. They're all pointing to the exact same conclusion. A massive drought hit this region right around 2200 BCE, giving us a really compelling potential timestamp for the famine described in the text. You know, the text doesn't just describe huge, dramatic events. It also gets into the nitty-gritty of regular seasonal weather. And these descriptions of wind and rain patterns, they give us another really powerful clue to help narrow down our time frame. The text specifically describes a hot summer wind known today as the Lu. Now, this isn't just any old wind. The Lu can only form when the nearby Thar Desert is a hot, arid, sandy desert, just like it is today. If the Thar were wetter and greener, you just wouldn't get this specific kind of wind. And geology, thanks to research from people like Singhvi and Thomas, tells us exactly when that change happened. Before about 3500 BCE, the Thar was simply too wet to create that wind. So if the text describes the Lu, its observations must have been made after 3500 BCE. This gives us our starting point, our lower boundary. So we have a time window now. But where exactly were these observations made? Well, it turns out the text gives us one more crucial clue, and it's embedded in the very way it marks the passage of time. Prashna 1 uses a 6-season calendar, and this system with its very specific divisions isn't universal. It's not something you'd find us anywhere. It perfectly describes the unique rhythm of the seasons right there. The heavy monsoon, followed by a distinct cooling-off period, and then a dry winter. You really only find that exact sequence in this part of the world. This gives us a geographical lock, placing the observers right where our first clue, the Saraswati River, used to flow. It all fits together. Okay, so let's recap. We've gathered all our independent clues from the physical record. A living river, a catastrophic drought, a specific desert wind, and a unique seasonal calendar. Now it's time to put them all together and see what the Earth's final verdict is. When we lay all the evidence out, you can see how the constraints start to build on each other. The Saraswati River tells us the observations were made before 1900 BCE. The Lu wind tells us it had to be after 3500 BCE. And the other clues, like the memory of that great drought, all point to the very same window of time. Each clue, derived independently from geology, just tightens the net. And here it is. This is the result. The convergence of all the independent physical evidence places the observations recorded in Prashna 1 squarely within an 1100-year window between 3000 and 1900 BCE on the northwestern Indo-Gangetic plain. This date isn't from linguistics or oral tradition, it's written in the planet's rocks, sands, and sediments. Now, scientific integrity is absolutely crucial here. So having established what the geology does confirm, it is just as important for us to be clear about what it does not confirm. The physical evidence, the geology, simply can't verify claims about things like eclipse predictions or different classes of solar rays. And while the text description of famine is powerfully consistent with the 4.2 caught event, we have to call it a strong inference, not something geologically proven. This is the honest boundary of our investigation. The geology confirms the time and place, but it can't weigh in on every single claim. That's where the science stops. And that leaves us with one final thought. We've just seen how geology can be used to read a history that corroborates an ancient text. It really makes you wonder, what other stories, what other lost histories are out there waiting to be read, not on paper or stone, but in the silent, physical record of the Earth itself?